mechanisms to fix and constrain meaning. Listen, for example, to Narrative Science's description of Quill. Quote, every data set, every database, every spreadsheet has a story to tell. Our advanced NLG platform analyzes data from disparate sources, understands what is important to the end user, and then automatically generates perfectly written narratives to convey meaning from the data for any audience at a limited scale. Automated insights, I have more quotations to this effect. Automated insights similarly writes, let your data tell its story. Algorithmic writing, then, is not writing untethered from the author, I'd like to conclude, but writing in the service of the alleged neutrality and omniscience of big data, the new ultimate source of knowledge. In this sense, it does indeed, to borrow Kidler's phrase, pretend to communicate a beyond. This beyond is what Will Davies has called the data sublime, the ever-expanding realm of digital information that produces awe and exceeds human comprehension through its sheer vastness and the forbidding opacity of its zeros and ones. Algorithmically generated text is the handwriting of the new God and the locus of his revealed word. For them, language is or should be a pellucid. Its architects are not Kabbalistic theologians, but positivistic Protestant ones. For them, language is or should be a pellucid medium of unambiguous, univalent truth, handed down from on high, optimized and customized for our convenient use. The real question raised by algorithmic writing is not, as some would have it, what the human now means, but what God or gods it asks us to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, that was brilliant. Please hold on to your questions so we keep them. And we will look at the Twitter at the end of the panel. Next up is Sophia, who is going to change over and
we switch.
Thank you, that was wonderful, Geoff.
Thanks.
All right, that sounds like a microphone that is working. Next up is Anira, who teaches at Columbia University, where she received her PhD in communications in 2014. Her book in progress is The Poet and the Candid, examines the meaning of prose in the 19th century portrait photography, and traces the rise of an aesthetic and a politics of photographic candor in the 20th century. And it's over to you, Sophia.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here. In keeping with our panel's theme of situating new media within a longer historical trajectory, I'm going to speak, hopefully with avoiding a coughing fit, I'm going to speak about the carte de visite, a form of photography that attained immense but short-lived popularity in the 1860s. What I'm going to argue is that the carte de visite represented an early instance of the photograph as social media. Because the carte de visite remains a decidedly marginal topic in media studies, I'll start with a bit of background. The carte was a small photograph of about 2 by 4 inches, usually a portrait, that was taken in a commercial photography studio, produced in multiples on paper, and then mounted onto cardstock. These cards were then sold for a relatively affordable price. They were about $1 to $3 per dozen in 1860, which is the equivalent to about $35 to $80 for a dozen today. So not super cheap, but within sort of the sphere of affordability for most of the middle class. Initially, cards primarily featured celebrities, most prominently Napoleon III and Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who we see above. But the enormous public demand for these images of public figures led photography studios to make use of this new method in order to sell ordinary people photographs of themselves. This strategy proved remarkably effective. People crowded the studios to get portraits taken, which they then distributed to friends, family, and distant acquaintances. Thank you. And many historians of photography have sort of said that this is kind of a signal moment in the democratization of photography. What I'd like to suggest today, though, is that where the relationship between photography and social media is concerned, what's past is prologue. We can see a precursor to the social sharing commonly associated with digital photography in the rise of the carte de visite. With the cart, a portrait that was intended for distribution, people of the 19th century saw a powerful means of virtual self-presentation. And in looking at this predecessor, we can gain historical context for the uses of digital photography in the present day, most notably in terms of the permeability or even the collapse of public and private boundaries, the virtual enactment of social ties or friendship, and the performance of identity through the photographic image. In an 1863 article in The Atlantic titled "Doings of the Sunbeam," Oliver Wendell Holmes addressed the recent popularity of the card, saying, quote, "Card portraits, as everybody knows, have become the social currency, the sentimental greenbacks of civilization," end quote. Holmes's quotation is revealing for two reasons. First, it underscores the cart's sheer ubiquity, and it was very ubiquitous. In England alone, 300 to 400 million carts were sold per year between 1861 and 1867. And this is at a time when England's population was around 20 million, so it was a huge number of these cards. But secondly, Holmes's designation of the cart as a kind of currency is suggestive of its circulatory nature and its commodity status. Like greenbacks, cartes de visite were objects that were exchanged among people, accumulating meaning through their dissemination. It's revealing that carts almost always bore the insignia of the commercial studio that produced them, sometimes on the front of the card and almost always on the reverse. And often this marker of the commodity status of the cart was large and prominent. It was often very, very pretty as well. While the cart was an object that was meant to represent the individual's likeness, it was also, in important respects, an advertisement for the studio that had produced it. The intimate commingling of individual subjecthood with commercial influence in the form of advertisements is a central feature of the social media of the 21st century, where ads are a constant presence on personal profiles. But this phenomenon was not altogether absent in the popular media of the 19th century either. The assumption of distribution and circulation that was an inbuilt feature of the cart informed the ways people presented themselves before the camera. Cartes de visite were akin to banknotes in that they were intended to be traded relatively indiscriminately, and they stood in for their bearer in the same way, irrespective of who was on the other end of the exchange. Both objects were treated as static representations of something that was much more unstable, whether that something was pecuniary value or personal identity. Cartes, then, tended to represent a generalized kind of selfhood, a socially sanctioned and standardized mode of self-presentation. Considering the vast array of environments in which the cart could be viewed and the generalized kind of likeness that it enabled, I think that one fruitful way to consider the cart is in terms of the context collapse that a number of digital media scholars, most prominently Dana Boyd, have identified as a salient feature of social networking. The idea, basically, that one's online identity could conceivably be consumed in a vast variety of different contexts, and that it's impossible to sort of control those contexts. To a considerable extent, the problem of context collapse also informed the creation and reception of the carte de visite. Because of the inbuilt imperative of circulation, the challenge that the photograph subject faced was to present themselves in such a way that their cart would come off well, irrespective of who was looking at it. So while the photograph subject could conceivably adopt any pose and expression that they liked, people tended to rely on existing conventions, ones that they had seen in other carts. Photography studios helped to perpetuate these conventions by providing people sitting in their waiting rooms with instructions on how to pose and decorating those waiting rooms with examples of successful images. People were thus guided toward appropriate modes of self-presentation in their photographs through cues from other photographs, and we see this very powerfully in these two carts from a Czech studio, which are nearly identical. The imperative of circulation was connected with the cart's inherent abundance. Carts, as I've mentioned, were sold in multiples, the better to distribute widely, and this feature was central to their commercial success. Collecting carts became a craze and a very lucrative revenue stream for photography studios. In fact, the most lucrative revenue stream at this time. The scope of a cart's dissemination depended on a number of factors, not the least of which was the doggedness of the individual agent in distributing his or her likeness and collecting those of others. Journalism dating to the era of the cart suggests that while some were aggressive collectors and distributors, others were far more skeptical about the value of such an enterprise. One commentator wrote in 1862, quote, "The demand for photographs is not limited to relations or friends. It is scarcely limited to acquaintances. Anyone who has ever seen you, or has seen anybody that has seen you, or knows anyone that says he has seen a person who thought he has seen you, considers himself entitled to ask you for a photograph." The claimant does not care about you or your likeness in the least, but he or she has got a photograph book, and as it must be filled, you are invited to act as padding to that volume, end quote. Significantly, the bearer of the cart did not have complete control over the reproduction or dissemination of her own cart either. Photography studios could procure negatives, licitly or without permission, from other photographers and reproduce these images. Or they could make reproductions from carts themselves with only a pretty minimal loss of image quality. Moreover, studio photographers retained negatives of each image that they took. They also retained the rights to these images, meaning they could reproduce and sell them if they liked. Often they did just this. So even if you were a complete unknown, by entering a studio and having your picture taken for a carte de visite, you ran the risk of having the studio reproduce your image, display it in their shop window, and sell it to the public without your knowledge. If you were exceptionally wealthy or attractive or interesting looking, this apparently was something that you could almost count on happening. People who witnessed the rise of the carte de visite spoke about the altogether novel and rather uncanny sensation of someone's likeness preceding them, of knowing the face before they ever met the person. An article on cartes de visite, published in the popular magazine Littell's Living Age in 1862, described this new phenomenon. Quote, "Even the cartes de visite of comparatively unknown persons so completely picture their appearance that when we meet the originals, we seem to have some acquaintance with them. I know that face somehow," is the instinctive cogitation, and then we recall the portrait we have a day or two past seen in the windows, end quote. One's face was no longer one's own. It could circulate independently of its bearer, and this new propensity of one's likeness to appear in public without the knowledge of its original was a source of anxiety for those who experienced it. With the circulation of the cart, we see that the loss of control over one's likeness, as a consequence of its ungraspable liquidity, is by no means a phenomenon specific to the digital age. Neither was the enactment of social bonds through the virtual a phenomenon specific to the digital age. The storage mechanism that developed to house the carte de visite was a card album, the genesis of the modern-day photo album. This quickly became the most popular way to display and share one's collection of cards. And in showing off your album became a popular social pastime, sort of a parlor activity. The album offered users the chance to curate and construct a narrative and perhaps a hierarchy of friendship, which might or might not accurately reflect the real strength of one's affective ties. In this respect, the album was regarded as strongly preferable to the alternative storage mechanism, the card box, where any card could come to the top at any time, resulting in an embarrassing social situation if the first card to appear was not an impressive one. An article in All the Year Round, which was a magazine edited by Charles Dickens, reflected on the capacity for carts to support one's claims to gentility. Quote, "You place the album in your friend's hands, saying, 'This only contains my special favorites, mind,' and there is her ladyship staring them in the face the next moment. 'Who is this sweet person?' says a visitor. 'Oh, that is dear Lady Puttycomb,' you reply carelessly. Delicious moment." So it was not only in the distribution and possession of carts, but in the display of one's impressive friends, one's kind of social network to others, that the cart was the site for the negotiation of one's social identity. From early on in the career of the cart, the public and reproducible nature of the medium informed the ways people presented themselves to the camera. Because one's portrait was intended for an indeterminate and potentially large audience that was likely to make assumptions about the sitter's character and class based on superficial signifiers, there were motivations for people to adopt a visual persona that presented them in an idealized fashion. Ostensibly, subjects did this with the hope that their cart would serve a performative function, bringing about social effects through certain kinds of carefully calibrated self-presentation. Whereas earlier forms of photographic portraiture, most notably the daguerreotype, which was sort of before the cart the most popular mode of being photographed, or of portrait photography at any rate. So whereas earlier forms of photographic portraiture had tended to focus closely on the facial features, offering a sustained, detailed limning of the face, cartes de visite demanded a different tack. In carts, sitters began to don fashionable clothing, stood in front of ornate backdrops, and assumed poses that connoted the sort of attitude they wanted the world to see. Here are some of the more unusual poses that I've encountered, but it should be noted that these are not typical. Most carts feature poses more like this. They're more standardized, the hands in the lap, the hand on the wife's shoulder. This is a very sort of conventional way of presenting yourself to the camera. The self-presentation that was central to the carte de visite was a development that in some respects parallels practices of online self-presentation today, though it has to be acknowledged that in the age of the carte de visite, these performances of identity were more static and less dynamic and variable. Virtual self-presentation through the carte de visite, in other words, depended on a single image that was supposed to sort of concentrate and encapsulate one's likeness, whereas present-day users of social networks have a great deal more flexibility. Alice Marwick, among others, has referred to the dynamic of self-presentation that one encounters in social networking applications as being informed by a kind of social surveillance, saying, quote, technically mediated communities are characterized by both watching and a high awareness of being watched, end quote. This awareness of being watched is central to virtually all portrait photography, most of which is predicated on the adoption of a certain pose with the anticipation of being captured by the camera. But this deep concern for how one comes off, this kind of self-conscious self-presentation, was a particularly central feature of the carte de visite, with the anticipation of public dissemination informing the ways people arrayed themselves before the camera. If we all know in the 21st century that a photograph can dissemble, we should give a bit more credit to our predecessors in the 1860s, who seemed to demonstrate a canny understanding of the fact that a photographic portrait could toy with reality, or just subtly shape reality in its own image. Thanks. And there's some cats. Why not?
Next up, we have David. Sorry, Patrick Davidson, who is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Media, Culture and Communication at NYU, and we always aim to finish this PhD very soon without too much drama. His work focuses on both the recent and the distant history of the internet, with a focus on the transition from bigger genres to digital ones.
Oh, so close. It's so close. Sorry, I'm just plugging in my own computer. I'm very stubbornly tied to my own machine, I suppose. There we go. Oh. I need to unmirror, if you'll allow me just one more moment of technical floundering here. So I'm very excited, actually, since the last presenter was talking about the 1860s, we're going to proceed in an exactly chronological fashion. I'm going to be talking about the 1880s, which works out quite well. I believe this may have solved the problem. Oh. All right. Hi there, my name is Patrick Davison. Like Sophia indicated, I'm a graduate student at NYU, and I'm here to talk to you today about chain letters, which is something I'm incredibly fascinated in. I'm going to do my best to force myself to speak slowly against my natural inclinations. But before we do anything else, I'm going to start with a quote that says, "Statements that electronic networking offers primarily, if not only, boons to democracy are now as prolific as gophers." That was written by Barbara Welling Hall in 1994. And I think that it is safe to say at this point that there have been countless instances of people touting the democratizing effects of digital computer networks, the internet, the World Wide Web, and specifically social media. So the goal of this presentation then is to try and explore one possible answer to the question, what do we talk about when we talk about social media being democratic? And political scholar Matthew Heinemann has provided a sort of list of what he thinks are the various meanings of democratization. And for this talk in particular, I want to focus on Heinemann's last sense, which is that it is challenging the monopoly of traditional elites. Or to put it another way, democratization is anti-monopolization. And given my own research, I'll be focusing specifically on media monopolization. And as I indicated on the title slide, my tool for contextualizing the democratizing capacity of social media is an unlikely precursor from the end of the 19th century, which are chain letters. They were invented in the US in 1887, and I believe that like social media today, chain letters were at the time a specifically democratizing medium, and I believe that specifically they democratized two things: the transfer and collection of money, and the broadcast of messages beyond an immediate social circle. So I'm going to discuss this in three parts. We're going to do a brief definition, explanation of what chain letters are and were. Second, we're going to do a discussion of how they were democratic. And then lastly, we're going to connect that to the contemporary social media moment. And along the way, I hope to introduce a sort of third, less obvious term to this pair of money and broadcasting, and talk about network data, which is a bit of an anachronism for the 19th century. But I want to talk about how chain letters and social media have a specific relationship to gathering information about networks. So, part one, what are chain letters? The easiest way to start this is by looking at an example. I received the following email in March of last year, 2014. It's called Collective Exchange. There's a lot going on here, but I just want everyone to focus on two parts, which is copy this letter into a new email and send to 20 friends. So, to put it another way, copy and forward combined in a single place. It is the combination of these two mechanisms that makes a chain letter different from other media. And just to provide a quick visualization, when you combine the instructions to copy and forward, the number of subsequent chain letters increases very, very rapidly until you have, in theory, hundreds of letters that are all identical out there circulating. And that's the plan. That's how they work. The very earliest chain letters, which began in 1887, used this very same copy and forward mechanism, but they had an additional step involved. This is a text from 1888, which is a typical instance of what one collector has called the charity chain letter. So in addition to copy and forward, it also asks each recipient to wrap a dime in paper and enclose it in an envelope and mail it back to the author of the original chain letter, which complicates our previous diagram a little bit as all of those dimes fly back to that single individual, which meant that in 1888, Mrs. George O. Herman could have easily imagined spending 1 cent or 2 cents or 3 cents, depending on the rate, and getting like $34 if it was only followed 4 times by each person, or four jumps. This is Alan Dundes, who's a folklorist. He refers to this as the magical feeling of geometric progression, that you can take a small number and then all of a sudden have a very, very big number. Now, there have been over time, over the last 100 years, many more variations of chain letters, but we're not going to talk about them. I just want to focus on this, the charity chain letter that uses the magic of copy and forward with requests for 10-cent donations. So, part two, these charity chain letters, what did they accomplish back in the 1880s? So, writing of her experiences using charity chain letters, the Deaconess Lucy Ryder Meyer wrote, there are dime letters and dime letters. Ours are not open to the objections urged against some, we think, and against ours there is no more opposition than there was at one time against contribution boxes in our churches. We recognize the fact that it is probably only a temporary help, but we thank God that it is lifting us out of a great emergency and widely advertising our work besides. Wrote that in 1892, but reflecting on a letter that she wrote in 1888. Now, she praises two functions of the chain letter. So first is that her chain letter raised over $11,000 in 1888, which is an incredible sum of money. And second, it's that Meyer was able to expose her words and her religious mission to a broad national audience. The reason that this is notable to us is that in order to accomplish these two functions, the chain letter had to subvert, or hack, if we'll allow the anachronism, the design of the 1880s postal system. Charity chain letters were only possible because of a sweeping set of postal reforms that occurred in the US during the middle of the 1800s and culminating in the Post Office Act of 1872. The move to a uniform and drastically reduced postage rate, the introduction of prepaid stamps, not to mention the standardization of federal currency, and even envelopes that you could seal. All of these were necessary preconditions for charity chain letters. But even as this system was being reformed in this way for the good of everyday citizens, there were still limits to this design. So during reform, the postal system introduced a money order system for transferring money that allowed any postal user to transfer money across the country, but at the exchange of certain structural controls. Money orders charged a flat 5-cent fee on every transfer, and they required the completion of specialized paperwork at the post office. This is actually a British version that the American version was modeled after, not the American version. So if chain letter recipients had been required to pay an extra 5 cents on top of their 10-cent donations, as well as travel to a post office in order to fill out extra paperwork for every donation, rather than just wrapping a dime in cloth or paper, it's unlikely that charity chain letters would have ever succeeded the way that they did. And so postal reformers who proposed these money orders simply didn't imagine that people would use postal delivery to organize broad distributed campaigns of micropayments. I mean, how could they have imagined that, right? To understand how broadcasting worked during this period, we also need to talk about newspapers. The US postal system had always had special rules for handling the circulation of newspapers. When the earliest American political elites, like Thomas Jefferson here, were considering how you could have a democracy on a continent as big as North America, broadcasting ideas through newspapers was their key in constructing an informed electorate. So from the outset of the postal system, newspapers were always mailed at an extreme subsidy. An entire newspaper could be mailed for 1 cent, where handwritten letters would be charged up to 25 cents per page. So even after reform, when the rate of letters was standardized down to the same rate as newspapers, these were now newly affordable, but they still were imagined as a tool of one-to-one communication. And handwritten letters, therefore, couldn't compete with the newspaper's ability to broadcast messages across the nation. And so this is why it's so significant that chain letters were able to create national audiences for non-elite individuals, because it subverted the monopolization of broadcast communication that had been designed by the country's political elites. Everyday postal users had a means of assembling money without money orders, and a means of national broadcast without a printing press. And before we leave the 1800s, I want to suggest that chain letters also provided people like Lucy Meyer with what I'll anachronistically call network data. So when she set out, Meyer must have had some idea that there was an imagined community of sympathetic Christians out there beyond her personal circle of acquaintances, capable of reading her words and sending her money. But with every response that she received from her chain letter, every return address that she collected, that network of people became less and less imaginary and more legible to her in a very material way. So along with money and broadcasting, we should of course consider that copy and forward, when combined, can serve as a tool for centralizing what was once distributed and for gathering data about the shape of a network. So part 3. Having talked about how copy and forward worked in the 1880s, we're going to jump 100 years into the future, which is now 20 or 30 years in our past, and ask, what does copy and forward look like after computers? So there are too many sort of trivial examples for us to even talk about. This was, I think, the earliest chain letter sent on ARPANET in 1982 to the message group, which was responsible for defining many of the standards that email now runs on. There was the Make Money Fast posts that filled up Usenet during the 1990s, which are shockingly long and detailed and super fascinating to read. There's what Marjorie Kibbe, who has called email forwardables, which you can still find collections of all over the web, which are almost all misogynist or conservative in some way, but are meant to be forwarded around to your friends. And of course, don't forget my email from part 1. Like, I am literally still receiving emails as recently as just last spring. But we don't need to consider just things that look like chain letters on digital networks, because network technology is fundamentally built on processes of copy and forward. Like Geoff points out here, the way computers pass around data follows the same patterns that chain letters used to follow through the Postal Service. To put a fine point on it, because data is a signal rather than an object, sending it always copies it. And because the internet is built as a packet-switched network, sending data also always forwards it along a chain of connected devices. And so this is what has changed in that 100-year period. In the 1880s, the process of copy and forward was a means of escaping or subverting the greater communication system. But with computer networks and social media, copy and forward isn't outside that system, it's the foundation of that system. I think one of the most telling examples of this are the various re-buttons that exist on many social media platforms, whether it's reblogging on Tumblr or retweeting on Twitter. So in contrast to the 19th century postal reformers, the designers of social media platforms not only allow for chain letter-like copy forward, they've incorporated it into the very design of the system. They facilitate it in a way. This would kind of be like the post office selling pre-printed chain letter stationery, which they don't do, to my knowledge. But okay, so this leads us all back to our starting question, which is what do we talk about when we talk about social media being democratic? Because if we want to talk about social media being democratic, we should also talk about what it now demonopolizes. So, and I think so far, much of the discussion around social media's democratization is focused around the same things that chain letters were also democratizing, right? When we talk about it, we talk about money and we talk about broadcast. And I think that social media has a lot going for it in those two categories. From Facebook coordinated protest actions or the streaming videos that came out of Ferguson protests last year, social media definitely gives individuals national and international communication reach, right? And with like the sort of assemblage of platforms like Kickstarter or Indiegogo combined with PayPal and Amazon payments, there are a host of new ways of transferring and collecting money from crowds of like-minded individuals. So, and we could have debates about how effective these functions are and whether Facebook and Twitter caused revolutions during the Arab Spring or how much a percentage PayPal can charge before it's no longer democratic. Like that could be one way of debating the democratizing effect of this stuff. But I think that that conversation could be enriched by adding network data to the conversation, because with social media now embedding processes of copy and forward into the structure of their platforms, like Lucy Meyer collecting those return addresses, they are able to collect such incredible quantities of data on individual users' activities. And so this is what I would propose is the new monopoly. And those who have control over it are the new form of an elite. And so therefore, instead of simply celebrating social media's ability to democratize the money and the broadcasting that have long been at the root of political action, I think it's time to start asking what medium, or what combination of processes, is going to be able to demonopolize the network data of social media. Of course, I'm not sure what form that will end up taking, but I'd be happy to have a conversation about it. So yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm just going to play.
Excellent talk, Patrick. Thank you. Don't forget your questions. Note them down or tweet them.
No, it's okay.
Okay, last but not least, we've got Carol Beckerman. He's a PhD candidate in communications at Columbia University. He's also the author of When They Come for Us, Will Be Gone? The epic struggle to save Soviet jewelry.
Yeah, not jewelry.
No, definitely not. And it was chosen as one of the best books of the year by the New Yorker and the Washington Post. I think we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and I think there are really very interesting insights here.
Okay. Hello. Thanks for having me. I am also going to talk about an earlier form of social media, so I'm going to jump about 100 years to the 1960s, 1970s, and talk about samizdat, which was basically underground writing during the Soviet era, most prominent during the 60s and the 70s. And then I'm going to try to make an argument about samizdat versus today's social media, and what might be, which medium might be more useful as kind of an agent of change for the opposition in Russia specifically. But first, a bit of background about kind of why I don't think that the internet is a space anymore in Russia where the opposition can meet and kind of develop itself and actually use social media to its benefit. Just a bit of recent background. In November 2012, the Russian Duma passed its first kind of major law on the internet, which was called tellingly on protecting children from information harmful to their health and development, which was broad enough that it really gave the government any ability to blacklist any individual URL, domain name, IP addresses that they deemed to be somehow harmful. And the definition of what constituted harmful was largely left up to the kind of the equivalent of the Attorney General in Russia. In just last year, there was a law that took things even a step further that was known kind of as the Bloggers Law, passed in May 2014, that really made any website, any blog, so to speak, that had over 3,000 visitors kind of considered to be a legitimate publication. They had to register with the government, forfeit anonymity, and become essentially legally responsible for the factual accuracy of their content. Again, very much a chilling effect on the ability to have conversation online. To kind of top it all off, another law in July 2014 required all web services, even foreign ones like Facebook and Twitter, to store their data of Russians on servers within the country, presumably so that the Russians could have control over that data. And sites which didn't comply with this by September 2016 would be blocked. In addition to all of this, companies like Facebook and Twitter face enormous challenges within Russia because they're frequently being asked to shut down pages and accounts. And infamously, in December 2014, just a few months ago, Facebook agreed to remove an event page for an opposition protest in support of this gentleman here, Alexei Navalny, who's probably the kind of most well-known opposition leader. They were asked to remove it. They removed it. Facebook has its own kind of business interests as well in Russia. It's competing with homegrown social media networks that, and so they have to stay competitive. And so they agreed to the government's demand. So all of this to say that it's a very, very difficult place for people in the opposition, what we might still call dissidents, in Russia to communicate. So let's go back to how an earlier generation of dissidents found a way to talk to each other in an even, one would argue, more oppressive environment. And that was the Soviet Union, and they used something called samizdat. Samizdat was essentially typed out pages. It was typed out on carbon paper, so you could have multiple copies, usually 3, 4, 5, though it would start to kind of get pretty faded, and distributed by hand. You would get a piece of samizdat, and then you would kind of do the same process again, and so much like a chain letter in some ways. And the content of samizdat consisted both of kind of original subversive writing that was done by dissidents themselves, and also material that was kind of smuggled into the Soviet Union from outside, writing that was illegal, sometimes serialized novels and essays that were critical of the Soviet Union that would then be turned into samizdat. But I want to talk specifically about what was probably the most influential samizdat journal that circulated underground. It was called the Chronicle of Current Events. This is the kind of the front page of an early edition from 1968. The Chronicle of Current Events was founded in 1968, and it was first kind of a way for dissidents themselves who were starting to be suppressed, there was a renewed suppression of dissidents in the late 60s when Brezhnev kind of finally took hold of power and instituted a lot of kind of neo-Stalinist policies, and people were starting to be put on trial for writing, et cetera. And so the dissidents decided amongst themselves to kind of keep a journal that would act as almost like an accounting of various human and civil rights violations that they themselves were experiencing as dissidents. But very quickly it became kind of a much more generalized journal of basically anything that people reported on that they had seen or could kind of validate that was a violation of in many instances, the Soviet Union's own rules regarding the civil rights. There was a total of 64 issues. It lasted from 68 to 82 and kind of fits and starts. It would mostly come out every month or two, except for when an editor was arrested or there was some kind of big crackdown, which sometimes happened for months at a time. The whole notion was to make a journal that had a kind of a very objective, dispassionate tone, something that would be a real contrast with state propaganda, which kind of often used this kind of jargony double speak. And so that was kind of the ethos of this group that put together this journal, was to try to make it almost clinical in its tone. And they did things like, would have transcripts of closed political trials. People would go in and take notes and then sneak them out, and they would be reprinted inside the journal. People would sometimes smuggle out news from closed labor camps. That, again, most Soviet citizens had no idea what were going on inside of those labor camps. And often it acted as the kind of like a proto-WikiLeaks. People who, like disgruntled people who worked inside of Soviet institutions would sneak out documents. Like, for example, they printed the list of banned books in the Soviet Union. Nobody actually knew what the list was, but somebody working in Glavlit, which was the kind of censorship office, smuggled out the list. So those types of things. So this was almost like it was transparency as a form of protest in a way. And most interestingly, it was the kind of way that information got to the journal. People were asked to, and I'll read you exactly the language that was used, to pass along any instances that they experienced of, again, any human or civil rights violation they saw. So if somebody, for example, was fired from their job because they had taught or spoken about an illegal book, you would write that down on a piece of paper, on just a small slip of paper, and pass that to the person who had given you your copy of the journal. And then that would make its way in a chain back to the editor who was in Moscow. The first editor was this woman, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, and that kind of circulation of information or centralization of information was established in issue number 5, which was early on in the journal's life in late 1968. And this is the language that she used. She said, anybody who's interested in seeing that the Soviet public is informed about what goes on in the country may easily pass on information to the editors of the Chronicle. Simply tell it to the person from whom you received the Chronicle, and he will tell the person from whom he received the Chronicle, and so on. But do not try to trace back the whole chain of communication yourself, or else you will be taken for a police informer. So much like, and I'll get to the analogies with today, but much like Tor, for example, you kind of only knew the person before you and the person after you in the chain. So that was the Chronicle of Current Events. Talia. So now now I'm kind of moving from talking about this very concrete thing to being a little bit speculative and trying to describe kind of what if we look at the situation of these activists, of these opposition activists inside Russia today, and look at their use of social media versus the use of samizdat for that earlier generation, and see kind of what the affordances are of each medium and what might be most effective for them as a group that's trying to kind of upend a status quo, to challenge the political leadership there. So samizdat versus today's social media. So samizdat had for it that it was passed from hand to hand, so it was less susceptible to surveillance. It was harder, as I just mentioned, to break the chain. There was a materiality to samizdat. So you knew if you had this in your hands that you were holding something dangerous, so it made the stakes quite clear. Unlike online, where the combination of anonymity and you're not being able to actually touch the dangerous thing can make you a little bit more reckless. So they were quite aware of the risks that they were taking. On the other hand, though, the network can be temporarily shut down pretty easily if the source is discovered. So, as frequently happened, the KGB would expend a lot of energy trying to find out who the editor was, and then they would arrest that person, or they would confiscate the typewriters that the initial copies of the journal were written on. And copywriters in the Soviet Union were each registered, so you could actually, if you could figure out the type, you could find a way to get back to the typewriter that produced it. But I guess what I want to say is that because of the difficulty of producing and disseminating this kind of painstaking process that we're talking about here, it fostered a dissident community that was small, but it was cohesive and resilient. Social media of today is obviously faster, greater scale. It has the affordance of being able to organize on an unprecedented level, coordinating mass activity, as we all know from the last few years. There's a much lower bar for entry, of course, than to take a document into your house that you know you might be caught with. But surveillance of the individual nodes in these networks is easier because you're leaving behind a digital trace, unlike when you pass along the journal is no longer with you. And the takeaway here, I think, is that it fosters a bigger community of potential activists, but one whose commitment might be weak and whose susceptibility to suppression relatively high. So what does this mean for today in Russia? Why would Samizdat better serve today's dissidents? And basically, I think that social media obviously has multiple roles that it can play in a situation of attempted political change. One of them is that kind of the instrumentality of it, that it can bring together individuals in large spaces, lots of people. But it can also be useful as an incubator, as a space for individuals, sometimes anonymously, to egg each other on, to test out oppositional identities and ideas. And that's certainly what happened with the Chronicle, because you had this completely oppressive environment where there was no concept of like participatory citizenship, where you would hold your government accountable for its actions. And yet the journal became a medium through which people began to feel themselves able to hold their government accountable. So it had that kind of incubation function. And for this other function, incubation, if we want to call it that, well, there's probably a better word for it, a Samizdat-like form of social media might be more effective. One in which activists create private networks where they can talk with one another and exchange information more discreetly. Switching then from a medium that facilitates staging huge protests to one that allows an opposition to build strength and develop a viable alternative might be more useful in Russia today. Now, I'm not suggesting that people return to using typewriters and carbon paper, but I do think that there are ways that you could possibly replicate Samizdat today, and I think they're all known to many of us, using things like VPNs and Tor, which hide IP addresses, things that I don't know a great deal about, but I'm aware of what they do functionally, things like CryptoCat and off-record messaging that allows for groups to talk to each other with much more encryption and authentication software involved. And my personal favorite, because it does kind of, it does make you think of the Soviet era, using USB sticks as kind of as dead drops. Putting them in secret locations. You go, you upload, you download information, but everything kind of stays with the USB. These are just some ideas for how a Russian opposition today might kind of replicate the affordances, the usefulness of Samizdat. Ultimately, though, they might not have much of a choice because the internet might not be all that available to them. That's it. Yeah.
I think now we can read.
Now is the time of questions. I think, first of all, we're going to have a look and see what's happening on Twitter. So, Donald, I think there's some noise on Twitter. That is the time to do a big shout out to the side-by-side people who've been watching the stream. How are we doing, Donald? You can get ready to ask your questions too.
Lots of comments, no questions. I'll take some questions from the audience. I'll see if I can summarize the conversation.
Yeah. Since you raised your hand first, you're going to go first, then Geoff.
Hi, I guess this question is mostly for Geoff, but maybe someone else will jump in. I really like the talk. I thought it was really great connection between, Platonic thought on writing and algorithmic text generation. I'm just wondering, maybe you can talk a little bit about how the authors of the algorithms themselves of natural language generation technology might sort of upset your sort of extension of Plato's thoughts on writing to natural language generation. I mean, when I
that's a very good question, and definitely one I want to think about more. So what I find interesting is the way that the creators of the algorithms are generally concealed in the way that they're presented a great deal. And so when you read the way that these are presented to the world by the people who developed them, what I was trying to suggest is there's this kind of theological aggrandizement of big data as sort of the author, right? That is kind of behind all of this, and that is the sort of beyond the wisdom of which is being communicated through the text. And so the fact that there are these sort of contingent human beings creating the means for that to happen is sort of, so a lot of things about language are taken for granted, right? In the way that, there's a way that, and this is another interesting thing in relation to kind of Barthes and other post-structuralist theorists, right? That these sort of contingencies of contemporary discourse are taken as kind of natural features of the world, so that the fact that an algorithm can sort of mimic a certain type of discourse, let's say sports journalism, there's no interrogation of that as a kind of specific conventional discourse, even though that is, it is necessary for it to be that for them to create this software in the first place. But generally, it's sort of represented as just a kind of natural feature of the world rather than something that is created by people. So that's, I think, how I would respond to that now, but there's more to say.
We have one question there. Do you want to go next? Would you like to go next? Okay.
This question is for Geoff as well. A lot of you acknowledge that your entire presentation might have been algorithmically text generated, and I love it regardless. So one concern I have is, for example, with WikiLeaks, in order for nation states to function, they have to have a lot of communication and documents. And I would think a lot about algorithmically text-generated documents and how this may provide a form of noise censorship where you have, not just 5 billion documents, but maybe 50 billion documents, and how, as subversives, how can we process that? And, will this be a new form of censorship, just censorship of redundant and non-intimate technical data, human data and communication, but will the state still be able to use that in order to function?
I think so, and I think that one of the more disturbing elements of the phenomenon that I didn't cover was the sort of customization, right? In other words, that the text can actually be individual, right? That part of the whole promise of these, according to those who promote them, is that that it can figure out what kind of articles you tend to read to the end, let's say, and customize the text that appears on your screen in order to make sure that it fits that. So obviously there's a great sort of potential for all sorts of manipulation and concealment that comes along with that kind of capacity. So that's the very partial answer. Ben Grosser's talk just in the last session about scare mail, right, was kind of an interesting example of how this, of how algorithmic text generation can kind of be turned against, or in his presentation of it can be kind of turned against and be both an interesting kind of avant-garde exercise in itself, but also something that can be used to kind of jam the channels of NSA surveillance. So that, I happened to just listen to that before coming to this panel, and so that's kind of an interesting way that these resources could kind of be exploited in different ways, I think.
Hi, Eric from MIT. I have a question for Patrick. I'm curious if you found any evidence that the kind of creators of these charity chain letters were aware of the kind of subverting and democratizing
Yeah, so the original inventors of chain letters were actually, so the original charity chain letters were extremely deliberately designed. And there's a sort of group of charitable middle-class American women that like very deliberately were trying to harness the like mathematical properties of geometric progression. And for instance, there was something I didn't cover, but all the original versions had something that was called a generational expiration date. So you send out the first one and it had an A on the top, and then you would say like advance the alphabet, and if you have a G, stop this chain. And so there was so much deliberateness on the part of the designers that they were like, oh, this will get out of control if we don't build in some kind of like undoing mechanism. And so while that amount of foresight definitely paid off, you know, it was also myopic in the way that they, you know, maybe our imitators won't also be as, you know, nice to put expiration generations on the thing. So there was definitely a deliberateness in that, and I think there was definitely, I think the subversion though wouldn't have been in their thinking because of how much it was tied to like Christian charity, which is in and of itself not very subversive, right? It's all like in the service of the Lord, and so that has a sort of cultural authority that goes with it, so, yeah.
Right, this question is for Cal. I really enjoyed talking about science math. Something that occurred to me is that even though it was a physical object you held in your hands for a time and you passed it on, it sort of took on a ephemeral character in a sense, like you got rid of it. So do you see the sort of ephemeral turn in social media today with some of the apps? Do you see that as having a place for sort of a new type of science a useful way to do that? Or do you see it more like a trap, considering that some of this ephemeral media doesn't really go for it?
Yeah. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. But I guess I made the second assumption that you have, which is, you know, we know that, and we have lots of evidence to tell us that it really doesn't go away, that it's not, and I think most people who use things like, is it Snapchat? Snapchat. Okay, I feel old. But, you know, apps like that, you know, most people understand at this point that it, you know, that it is different than, you know, a piece of paper that you have that pass on that's not in your possession, and that it does maybe leave some trace, or there are stories of it getting back to people, or so I tend to think that I guess it's if software is created, if apps are created that kind of can assure the ephemeralness of what you're producing, then I can imagine something that would be quite useful for, you know, Syrian dissidents trying to communicate with each other and afraid that they're being surveyed. But otherwise, I think there is kind of a feeling that whatever you do, you're being, you know, you can't be watched. It doesn't quite have the experience of paper or something that's being seriously encrypted, like I understand that the Tor uses, for example.
Okay, we have there a question at the back. So, Annie, did you someone say something?
Trying to help us.
Thank you. Great presentation, everyone. I really enjoyed it. This question is for Annie. I mean, I really liked the presentation, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about your rationale for your research. I mean, I really liked the presentation, but I was left thinking, okay, so social media has a history, functions, etc. But what do you want to do with that? I mean, I guess that's what do you want to do with that knowledge? What is the aim of your research, so to speak? Yeah.
I'll wait for the microphone. Well, I envision this element of my research, which admittedly is in a pretty sort of early state, as sort of part of the project that I've seen of media historians sort of working to contextualize and historicize social media by looking at sort of early iterations of it. And I think of the work of like Lisa Gittleman, for example, and sort of thinking through the ways in which, you know, we can conceive of new media as we think of it today, not as something that's an entirely fundamental break from old media, but as sort of a continuity, as sort of a continuation of that trajectory. And I started doing this research because a few years ago I started seeing a number of articles on digital photography, and I don't think they're necessarily representative, but there was a trend that sort of suggested that digital photography is what's current, is what's, it's concerned with what's of the moment, whereas old photography is what sort of gets consigned to the dusty shoebox. And it's a cliche, but I think that there is sort of a tendency to think about old photography in terms of memory, and think about its memorial functions, thinking about the way in which it's sort of that has been that Roland Barthes identifies it as. So I wanted to think about the ways in which old media have had novelty, had currency in their time. So that's sort of my main intention.
More questions? Donald, would you like to ask one?
No.
Someone at the back there?
Yeah.
Thank you.
My question is for Patrick et al. So you kind of posed the question, how do we take back ownership of data to democratize social media? And what are your thoughts on this trend of decreasing users on Facebook and these emerging other apps like Snapchat, that while they're not perfect, it does seem we are sort of starting to recognize the sense of data as currency and exploring using media to get around that. So I was just kind of curious about your thoughts.
Do you want to go first?
No, I'm happy to.
I can say that my general reaction to that sort of trend is very exciting, right? Like the idea that there is a sort of developing zeitgeist about an awareness or like changing the sort of like hygiene of your data practices. I will also express a skepticism or perhaps an ambivalence about stuff like Snapchat, because I think that ephemerality, as we were sort of like gesturing to just a moment ago, might be a Trojan horse, not Trojan horse, like might be a red herring, to mix my metaphors, or I guess switch my metaphors, mid-race, so to speak. But I actually just, because I've been puzzling and anxious that I didn't have a better answer to my own question, and I think that having just watched some of the earlier presentations today, I'm beginning to suspect that cryptography or encryption might be that new process more than ephemerality, because I don't think deletion is necessarily sustainable or actionable in the same way. So yeah, I think that would be my answer.
The only thing I guess I would add to that is that, there is, I tried to talk about kind of two functions of kind of what is social media for, especially in situations where, you're trying to use it towards change, speaking very generally and broadly. And one, as I talked about, Sami's not being useful for, was to kind of incubate a certain kind of different relationship with the state, different kind of forms of oppositional identity. And for that, I think I don't know if it's deletion or encryption, but like having a smaller network of people who are kind of, who you can trust more, seemed very useful. But the thing that you're losing in doing that is the other function of social media, the other thing social media is good for, which is assembling large groups of people to do things which can be obviously incredibly effective in moments of trying to make change, as we've seen. Sometimes it ends up backfiring or not being completely effective, or not kind of doing enough. And I guess that's why I felt like the corollary of is important, of knowing how to also have these smaller networks, because just being able to assemble people, if you don't know exactly what your aims are, if you don't know what the alternative is, if you don't have some kind of vision that's been incubated, can be counterproductive too. But all that to say that, I guess to be aware of, once you shut off those avenues, in social media, once you kind of decrease and become smaller, then you're also kind of limiting the effectiveness of that other function that social media can have.
We have time for one more question.
My question is for Geoff. You mentioned that science that was natural person complicit and resilient. And I just want to ask you, like, to explain that further to me, because in my mind, in a small network, in a very small community, if there's like a traitor, if there's like something bad, then it's really felt strongly, and then the network kind of breaks down. Whereas like in a larger network, maybe it's not as like it's kind of brushed off.
Yeah.
He's expecting like to resilience.
Right.
Thanks.
I think what you're saying is true. I think, you know, in the sense, and I tried to say that as well, that it can very easily break down when you have a small number of people. I think by resilient I meant that it's a lot harder to produce. It's a lot harder to, it was painstaking to really create Samizdat, and you had to be very secretive about it. You're creating something physical, you have to find the typewriter. I mean, I could go through the whole process of what it meant to actually create this stuff and pass it along. And you know, a lot of the criticisms that we have of like the slacktivism of today, you know, you can compare that up next to what it took to actually, you know, get your ideas across. And the other thing was this, when I'm talking specifically about the chronicle of current events, that moment of a person deciding that they were going to go from being just a passive Soviet citizen to saying, I saw something and I want to write it on a piece of paper and pass it along to this person who I guess I trust, you know, gave me the journal so that it can be published in this, Samizdat. That was an incredible, I mean, the threshold for getting there was so high. You had to really overcome fears, overcome the history that you knew, you know, and so it demanded of you a certain kind of, you know, maybe resilience isn't quite the right word, but, you know, you had to kind of get there mentally, emotionally, you know, psychologically, and it took more, my sense is, than some of the kind of social media activism that we might see today.
Annie, you have something to say as well? No? Okay, I think with that we're going to thank our lovely panelists here. And I think you can talk to them and buy them a drink perhaps and all the rest. Thank you, you're all fantastic.
Thank you.
Do you have anything published on this?